Now, can we talk about a scene from Mr. and Mrs. Smith that you identified as a particularly strong example of your work? And it's the scene where they've made each other as assassins, and it comes all to a head in that dining room episode.
The setting was incredibly important. I mean, that scene is one of the first scenes I came up with when I came up with the idea for the movie. The marriage therapy scenes probably came first. And then the two scenes that are in the dining room. There's a first scene earlier in the movie where they're having a sort of dead...
Right, the very dry,
yeah.
We've been married too long, we're at a steam dinner.
Exactly. That you've seen in, Ordinary People in American Beauty, and, probably most people have seen in life too, to some extent.
Now, when you came up with that scene, did you know it would have a corresponding payoff?
Yeah,
okay.
I did. And so when you ask how important is the location's everything, because the setting is telling you that, there's something I love doing in movies, and I love when scripts do this in general, is when you have a sort of rhyming scenes, you have mirror scenes, partly just because it's a nice, easy, quick way to tell the audience, look how far we've come in the film. Right. Same space, same characters, totally different dynamic. As opposed to if that was in the kitchen, it wouldn't be quite the same symmetry or asymmetry to it. It would be telling the audience, look at the arc.
Right. So you never changed the location, it was always dining room?
It was always dining room. I think at some point we talked about it starting in the kitchen and then transitioning into the dining room, which it does a little bit. But once they're really into the back and forth ping-ponging of the scene, we always wanted to be in the dining room. One, to really let you know that it was dead the first time because it was a marriage full of lies, and suddenly it's coming to life because the lies are being stripped away. There's a line that Angie has earlier in the movie where she's in marriage therapy by herself, and she says, there's this huge space between us, and it just keeps filling up with everything we don't say, which is one of my favorite lines in the movie, and I think she did a lovely job with it. And what I wanted this scene to do was, the lies are starting, all the things they don't say are starting to sort of be erased, and they're starting to come together. And the interesting thing about the scene was, it is a scene that was Doug, the director's favorite scene. It was a scene that was the actor's favorite scene when they read the script. Even, the first incarnation of this movie was Nicole Kidman and Brad Pitt. And
right, Nicole had to drop out.
Had to drop out because actually she just kept doing Stepford Wives, and the movie kept shooting and shooting, right. And we had to start the movie because Brad was going into Ocean's 12, and ultimately it just felt like it was going to shoot forever. And but it was, she identified it as a scene that was one of her favorite. I think one of the reasons that people like the scene so much is it's a scene where the subtext is everything. What's not being said is everything in the scene. If you look at the dialogue in the scene, it's not great dialogue. It's not even particularly interesting what they're saying. What they're not saying is what's charging the scene, the energy of the scene. And so, for me, it was always about, as a screenwriter, the best scenes that you can write are scenes in which subtext start to dominate text. And this was a scene where the subtext is deadly. And the text is totally mundane.
Right. The subtext is life and death.
Yeah, the subtext is when are they going to pull a gun and kill each other?
Right.
And or the scene that someone has with their wife or their husband where I know you're having an affair, but I'm not going to ask the question.
Right.
And how close can you get to the question without actually asking it? Because asking it is scary.
Right.
In a way, you want to know the answer, but you don't actually want to know the answer. And so we talked about this scene in those terms always. It was always some sort of emotional metaphor for something real as opposed to, a genre answer. And part of what we found in developing and then in the pre-production, the production processes, we found ways to physically manifest the sort of ping pong. In addition to Nicole being the original actor for Jane Smith, there was a moment in time where John Woo was actually going to direct the movie. He was the first director on the film, and then he fell out. But one of John's notes, I remember it really vividly, the first time we ever met, was, I want this scene when they're in the dining room to be about one-upsmanship, not just in dialogue, but also in physicality. And so the idea that the knives keep getting bigger came entirely out of that meeting with John. And it was actually something that he did in one of his early movies that nobody's ever seen. It's sort of a strange screwball romantic comedy film.
Right.
So we tried in every form of the scene. When they're standing, it means something. When they're sitting, it means something.
Right. Where'd you come up with Who's Your Daddy Now?
Who's Your Daddy Now, I have to say, and this is something that happens to screenwriters all the time, I didn't come up with. Angelina Jolie came up with.
Well, it's a very generous admission.
Yeah, no, well, it's something that when we were doing it, I felt like maybe over the top, maybe a little too...
And of course it ends up in every trailer.
It is in every trailer. Yeah. There was a t-shirt sold at Kits in that store in Robertson that says, Who's Your Daddy Now?
Right.
And it is, she made it work and not make it too broad.
Right.
The thing that was the challenge about this movie was that the tone is playful and sort of mischievous and dangerous, and clearly hyper-real without ever becoming broad.
Right.
And I think that was the challenge in pitching it, and it was the challenge in writing it, and it was absolutely the challenge in making it. And I think that one of the many things that Doug did brilliantly was he policed the tone of the movie. He really authored the tone and kept the performances right on the edge of being ridiculous.
Right.
And the actors so fully understood that. It's interesting, and I think this is a great exercise to do as a writer, but it's also really good to do when you're going into production in a film, which is we actually watched 3 or 4 sample films with the actors before we started shooting the film.
Films a little bit like in the genre of what you were doing?
In the genre, but not in the genre.
Right.
More in the tone. What we watched were the first Thin Man movie, Philadelphia Story, and Prizzi's Honor. And Prizzi's Honor is obviously sort of 1-to-1 ratio.
Right.
That's the easy one. Oh, and War of the Roses. Sorry.
Okay.
Which is also a clear antecedent.
So great battle of the sexes movies, or movies with great banter between men and women.
Right, and Thin Man and Philadelphia Story were the two, I think especially for Brad, Philadelphia Story, that we really felt like if we can somehow in our strange, twisted action movie mimic the tone of these screwball comedies.
That's great.
We'll have something kind of special. And you were asking before about the sort of cross-pollination of genres. I do think that unless you have a property now that's like Superman or X-Men, or you have to do something interesting and different to get audiences to pay attention, because they've seen every movie.
Right.
They're so much more savvy than we were when we were kids,
Yes.
I think. They watch 500 different stations of TV. They can see The Shield, Nip Tuck. They can see these incredibly sophisticated soprano shows on TV. You have to do something that, like those shows, pushes the boundaries of whatever genre you're playing in.
Right.
And so from the beginning, we were like, this movie has to be a classic 40s screwball comedy,
Right.
In the package of a sexy action movie.
Well, it's a huge transitional scene into the next section of the film where they start testing each other. Were you aware of how this has to work? This scene is very critical, and were you aware of how important it was going to be?
Yeah, no, I think that as a screenwriter, one of the things that's most important is building the architecture of the movie, is structure.
Do you take those structural milestones very seriously?
I don't take the page numbers very seriously, but I take the structural milestones seriously. I mean, I do think that Hollywood movies conform to a 3 or 5 act structure.
Right.
And this was, for me, a very clear 3-act structure. And so I always knew the end of the first act was the moment where they start hunting each other,
right.
To some extent. And there were incarnations of the script where that was page 25. There were incarnations where that was page 45. I think in the movie it's about 40 minutes in.
What's the ultimate running time of the film?
About 2 hours.
Okay.
And which is close to about the ultimate page count of the script. The process of making this movie was a really circuitous one. I mean, Doug Liman has a sort of workshop process.
Right. Whose idea was it to bring the film to Doug Liman after John Woo?
Brad and Nicole.
Okay, great.
Brad, and after, I don't remember how John fell off, but when Brad came onto the movie, Brad hadn't been on the movie yet. It was Nicole and John, and then John fell off, and Brad and Nicole sort of made a list of directors they really wanted to work with, and Doug was the top of that list. Brad had I think, been involved with Born Identity at one point.
Okay.
They developed it for Brad, and he ended up doing another movie and really admiring that film and wanting to get the chance to work with Doug again. And Doug had actually read a draft of Mr. and Mrs. Smith and passed on it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, liked it, as he claims at least, but passed on it. And in fairness to him also, between that draft and the draft he was then sent, I had done a lot of character work on the script.
At whose behest?
The studios,
Okay.
New Regency, and then with John and Nicole.
And was that good input?
Great input.
Great.
Great input because, I think it was interesting. The balance for me in writing these genre movies is always between action and character, or story and character. And I think the balance initially was weighted more toward story or action than it was character. Now I think the way that I write, I weight more toward character and sometimes need to broaden out a little bit.
Well, there's so little dialogue in this scene. How do you establish tone in action?
Well, one way you establish tone in action is, like I said in the exposition, the way you write the scene. And it's a really, if you were to read the screenplay page, it's a really overwritten scene in the exposition. I describe all the different looks. I describe the way he looks at her hand. I describe the way her hand tenses around the knife. Mm-hmm. Once we came up with the idea of the knives, I described the size of the knives, which become very important in the scene.
Right.
So part of the way you define tone is in not dialogue, but the exposition, the prose of the script. And then also, you create tone by what is not said.
Right.
And one of the many things I've learned from Akiva, craft-wise, is movies work best when you trust the actors to play the scene without having to play the dialogue.
Right. See, that was the problem with Lost in Space. We didn't trust the,
Yeah,
we didn't trust the actors enough.
Well, there's a robot you
There's
have
a
to trust.
robot.
And,
It was hard.
There's a lot of challenges.
Yeah, I did trust the robot, though.
Okay, well,
Right.
then it was just the actors. You had a couple of Academy Award-winning actors. Maybe you should have trusted William Hurt. I don't know.
There you go.
But at any rate, I think that when less is said in movies, sometimes it's more powerful because the great luxury you have of movies that plays don't have is you can have a big head 50 feet tall on the screen.
So
the
less
subtlest
really,
glance,
less is more.
Yeah, it's the subtlest glance, I think, will tell you more than what do you have in your pocket, honey?
Right. Did things change during shooting for that scene?
Yeah.
Were there revisions along the way?
Yeah, because Doug works in this sort of workshop style, there are revisions in every scene as you work.
Right.
Doug's a perfectionist, I mean, genuinely. And what ends up happening is we do the scene, I rewrite the scene, we do the scene, I rewrite the scene until we get it right. And
Does that include blocking with the actors? Does Doug come to the set and
oh yeah,
change things after you've
Doug can change the production design.
Right.
It's not just the blocking, the table might change.
Right.
And it's really always in service of getting the scene right. And this movie especially, because the tone was so delicate in a way. I mean, not delicate in that it was fragile, but just that it's a tenuous balance.
Right.
He really wanted to make sure that we got every scene right. And this was an important scene because it's a hinge scene structurally,
right,
and because it's a scene that we all loved. So on set, I would say there were quite a few changes in blocking, but the biggest changes for me were two. One was, it's little in the movie, but it was big in terms of the emotion of the scene, which is when Brad thinks that she maybe poisoned his food. In the original incarnation of the script, he chews and chews and chews, and then takes his napkin and takes the food out of his mouth.
Right.
And a way a normal person would, right? And we got there, and it was Brad who said, "That's the wrong impulse. I should swallow it." He's like, if I take the food out of my mouth, she's won the first round.
Right.
And you don't have the back and forth. The action, as much as the dialogue, is important in terms of maintaining that.
Right.
She does one tennis swing, he does another tennis swing. And the second he takes the food out of his mouth, the point's over. The ball's down. And so we actually shot it with him taking the food out of his mouth. And the next day, he said, it just doesn't feel right. I want to swallow it, and I want the swallow to be a fuck you to her. And when you see the way he plays that swallow,
yes,
it's totally a fuck you. It's fantastic. And that's one of the things that great actors and I think even more movie stars give you, are those free little gifts where they realize what they can do with performance.
Well, it sounds like all of you were on the same path. I mean, it helps
Yeah.
when everyone's got the same vision.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think this was a movie where, from the producers, Akiva Goldsman, Lucas Foster, who was on set the whole time, Doug, the actors, myself, we really were making the same movie. It wasn't an easy movie to make, but it was always the same movie.
Because that tonal line you had to walk is very fine.
Yeah, and I think the understanding of it being a truly character-driven film, I think in the hands of a different director, I think with different actors, we would have privileged the action a little bit more, or privileged the story. And the truth is about the film, it's a kind of a movie without a story. I mean, the plot or the super plot of the film just disappears at the second act of the movie. And in the third act of the film, you actually start to feel the absence of plot.
Right.
And I think that was one of the challenges of writing it, was I always actually had more plot than what we had in the movie. And we actually shot a lot more plot. There was a whole sort of subplot with John and Jane's respective bosses, and they were sort of became the supervillains of the movie in the third act of the film, and they became the threat. And we shot that. We shot that with Jacqueline Bisset and Terrence Stamp for a couple weeks, and it didn't work. And then we reshot it with...
Did audiences ever see it?
No.
Okay.
We saw it, and then we reshot it with Angela Bassett and Keith David. Great actors across the board. It never worked. And we were sitting there saying, are the scenes not working, or is it just not working in the context of the movie? And what we discovered was the challenge of the third act should not come from the outside, it should come from the inside. It should be the challenge of actually having to operate as a couple.
Right.
And the models we always talked about structurally for the film were never action models, they were always romantic comedies.
Right.
And romantic comedies, the third act of the film is not the best friend becomes the problem, it's that suddenly they're together and it's just still not working.
So that led you to stay on the couple, this genre blending and taking a cue from romantic comedies.
Yeah, and it was Doug, very insanely or courageously, depending on your perspective, he just pulled all that out of the movie one weekend. And we came into the editing room and we were like, okay, the movie has no story now, but emotionally I'm engaged.
Right, it's a relationship story.
Yeah, and what he had essentially done is taken out every scene that doesn't have Brad and or Angie in it.
That's a brave move.
It is, and it was a brave move for the movie, and we didn't know until we tested it if audiences weren't gonna sit there and say, what's the story?
Right.
What am I rooting for in the third act of the movie?
But of course everyone can relate to a quarreling couple.
Yeah, they can, and that's what we found, is that people, and I mean, I still think the third act of the movie is quite flawed, but I think what keeps people engaged is they're watching something that they've experienced.
Right. Who makes the call to Keith David and Angela Bassett that they're not in the movie anymore?
Doug. I think that there's a scenario in which the producers or the studio could have made that call, but Doug is a very one of the many things I really love about him is he's a very moral and a very good person, and he's a very honest person. Very honest, without a cruel bone in his body. Sometimes that honesty is tough to hear, you know, because you're not going to be in the movie, or this scene isn't working.
Right.
But it always comes from a place of wanting to service the movie, and he's very human. And so he didn't let anybody else make that call. He made the call to those actors, which is not an easy call to make.
Sure.
But you know, those actors got paid, and they weren't the stars. They were never going to be the stars of the movie, so it wasn't as though they thought they were suddenly off the poster.
Right.
And you know, the thing about working in this type of style is it can go both ways. In that those are characters and actors who got cut out of the movie, and Vince Vaughn's part began as maybe 5 to 10 minutes of screen time and turned into 20 to 25 minutes of screen time.
Right.
Because he's like the most insane, manic, gifted improvisational actor I've ever been around.
It's like having Bill Murray in Tootsie or something.
Yeah, yeah. It's like we have so much material that like it broke my heart that we lost that isn't in the movie. And what he does brilliantly is he sort of cantilevers out. He builds on whatever the scene is. He keeps the goalposts structurally of the scene intact. He gets to each of those places you need to get to tell the story. But how he gets to each goalpost, he goes like 500 miles another direction and then hits it, and then another 500 miles and hits it.
Now with actors like these, you're getting a great input. But in terms of like when you sit down and write dialogue for your characters, is it a separate process from the action and the plotting out the structure?
Yeah, it is. I like to write dialogue only once I really know the scene. I mean, the way that I work actually is I'll spend most of my day outlining whatever the scenes are I'm going to write that night. And when I say outlining scenes, I mean like every detailed beat of the scene except for what the words coming out of the actors' mouths.
Right.
And what I will do is I'll say what the intention of those words is going to be. So this is the piece of dialogue in which he tells her, fuck you, or he tells her, I love you, or whatever the subtext is. I don't actually write the text yet. And I'll also do a lot of experimentation, which I think is a really good strategy for writing. I'll experiment with the scene in that I'll look at all the secondary characters or all the other characters in the scene and try to tell the scene from their point of view. Not because I ever will, not because like I'm never, the person in deep background is never, but you might find some little tiny surprise, some little piece of texture, 1 out of every 15 times you do this in a scene, that's going to bring that scene to life in a way that it wouldn't otherwise.
Right.
And sometimes just to turn a scene on its head to know that it's working.
Right.
So I'll do a lot of just insane, obsessive, is this scene working? What are the 10 different ways I can tell it? What happens if I end the scene midway through? What happens if I start the scene midway through? How does it keep changing? So that by the time I break and have dinner, I know what the scene is.
Right.
And then I have dinner, and then I hang out and do whatever I'm going to do to be human. And then I go back to work at like 10 or 11 o'clock, and that's when I write the dialogue.
Okay.
And I find it's a lot easier to write dialogue when you know what the scene is.
Right.
Because then now you're just coming up with words, as opposed to having to discover what the words mean.
Right. Do you have rules for writing a sex scene?
Rules for writing a sex scene. Kind of stay out of the way, I think is rule
How
number 1.
graphic do you get in the description?
Well, I'll give you an example.
Do you play music in the background while you're writing?
No, it's not really. Like I don't do sense memory.
Okay.
Like no, it's not method writing.
Right.
No, and thankfully, my sex life is not quite, what you saw in Mr. and Mrs. Smith. I never like punch my partner or smash them into things.
There's time yet.
Yeah, no, there is, and I'm very aspirational. But the way, I'll give you an example. The Mr. and Mrs. Smith sex scene was what was written in the script was they kiss and roll out of frame.
Okay.
And what's in the movie is a lot more than that.
Right.
Once we knew pretty early on, actually, that it was going to be more than kissing and rolling out of frame because it just felt like that was incomplete for what it followed. It was sort of, that was the culmination of the action. Because the action in the house that precedes that sex scene in Mr. and Mrs. Smith is partly, that's the sex.
Yeah.
The sex itself is just the climax.
Right.
And so, we needed more climax.
Right.
So when
Doesn't everyone?
Yeah, no, fair enough. I get it. But when I was tasked to write that climax, I still wasn't going to choreograph what that action was going to be, but I did, as I was sort of talking about before, tonally say what the sex would be. And I think it was something like it's fierce and feral and yet enough tenderness to suggest love.
Right.
And if you watch the sequence, whether that or if there's going to be a director's cut of the DVD where there's more sex in it, there is obviously a whole lot of violence and a whole lot of action, but there are these moments of real tenderness too. So you kind of want to stay out of the way.
So again, a scene that combined tone or arrived at the right tone through a variety of methods.
Yeah, and a scene that's obviously nonverbal. Right. Except for the one piece of dialogue that remained from the first draft to the last, which is a callback from when they first fell in love in Bogota in the movie where he says, "Hiya, stranger, hiya back."
Right. That's a nice recall.
It is, and again, it's just it's shorthand for the audience. It's saying that spark they had at the beginning of the relationship that everybody has felt when they fall in love for the first time is back.
Right. Now, in your experience, have you been welcomed on the set a lot? Is that rare for a writer?
I do think it's rare for a writer, and I've been very lucky to be welcome on the set.
Has it been a common practice for you to be on the set?
I've been on the set of every movie I've written, yeah. Even movies I've rewritten, like Fantastic Four, I was on the set of that. I've been on the set for different reasons, and I've stayed on in different ways.
Yeah, what are you asked to do when you're on the set?
So many different things. On a Mr. and Mrs. Smith, when you work in a more process-oriented, sort of workshop-y style, I'm rewriting every day. So sometimes I'm rewriting just to arrive back at where the scene began so that we know that it's the right scene. Sometimes I'm rewriting because there are pieces of dialogue that need to be rewritten, or because the actors.
And sometimes you're a producer and you're functioning in that capacity too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what happens for writers on set is a lot of the time you are operating in a producerial capacity.
Right.
A lot of the time what you're doing is either, and a little bit of a directorial capacity as well. Sometimes you're just helping the actors understand the scene better, which is traditionally imagined to be the domain of the director.
Right.
But I think open, inclusive, collaborative directors want that from a writer.
Now, Doug has a reputation for being a little bit of a loose cannon. Is he more vocal on the set than I've seen him be in general meetings? Or?
He's more verbal.
Okay. Or did you step in and kind of like help communicate ideas to the cast?
Well, a couple things. One is, I do think Doug is a loose cannon, but I think the thing that's pretty almost magical or alchemical about Doug is he's like a loose cannon with a very precise target.
Right.
You know, it's like he shoots this huge thing, and yet somehow it hits this tiny little bullseye.
Yeah, every time he has I mean, his movies are hugely successful.
Yeah.
And people go, it's a common reaction like, Doug, go figure.
Yeah, and the other thing about his movies are they're very specific in tone.
Right.
I mean, Born Identity, now it seems like, because I feel like people are trying to mimic it in some form, but when it came out, it was a really fresh tone. It was like after the James Bond movies.
It was like the anti-Bond.
Yeah, it was. And that's a hard movie to make.
Right.
And Mr. and Mrs. Smith is an extremely difficult tone, I think. And Go, I think, is a very specific tone. And Swingers is, like, to me, almost the most precise target in a way. So however he gets there, he does get to this very authored, very specific movie. And in terms of the day-to-day, Doug is, I think Doug searches for what the movie's about, and once he finds it, he's incredibly good at articulating it.
Right.
And he is very articulate and verbal on set, and is also very inclusive and collaborative. And so I was there, Akiva was there, we worked with him, we worked with the actors, we worked with a second unit. It was a group process, and you sort of become, I mean, you know this, on any movie where you work on, where you're really on set, you become a family.
Yeah.
And more often than not, you become sort of a dysfunctional family.
Right, but it sounds like you had a great collaboration going.
We did. It was amazing. And it wasn't as though any single person had a single skill set.
Right.
It was that everybody sort of like was cooking in the kitchen the whole time.
Do you ever get inspired to write by things around you?
Yeah, I get inspired to write by music a lot. I get inspired to write by other people. I mean, I listen to a lot of conversations, whether I'm in the conversation or they're just at the next table. So that's probably where most of my inspiration
So you're
comes.
eavesdropping out there.
Basically, yes. Yes.
Well, we have an exercise to help jog your creativity.
Okay.
We call it the object. Frederick, the tray, please.
Oh, I was wondering who this guy was the whole time. I thought I was underdressed.
Well, it's very simple. There's an object under that tray. It's carefully chosen by us.
It feels like the scene from La Femme Nikita where there's going to be a gun under it and I have an
Right.
assignment.
It's not that easy.
Okay.
It's random to you, and the object of the object is to come up with a story about it. Tell me what it is, and then I'll ask you why you came up with that story.
Okay.
Got it?
Okay, yes. It's very daunting, but yes.
Show the man his object.
Your object, sir.
May I take it off the tray?
Oh, yes, be
Take
my
it,
guest.
Own it.
Wow, this is a tough one. I want to go to the poison dart place, but I want to resist the poison dart place. You know, I just because I'm resisting the poison dart place, I would go to the Fantastic Voyage. Like, this is a spaceship. You know, a family of 4 or 5 people need to get into the grandmother who's like dying, and they shrink them down to fit just on the little wings of this little guy right here.
Right.
And somehow this penetrates in and goes in and stays in.
They penetrate grandma?
Yeah, well, there's something about the word dimplex that made me
Right.
feel like this should take place in a hospital somewhere.
Or it looks like I imagine that word might remind you of a private spacecraft.
Yes, absolutely, as does AccuPart. So I, you know, the first thing that pops to mind after the poison dart, James Bond, would be the miniature spaceship.
Very cool.
For no other reason than, you know, I like movies where people shrink into miniature size.
Right.
That's another genre that is underutilized and underserved by Hollywood. I don't know, you know, I guess that's the first, so I'll stay with that first instinct, actually. You know, the one thing that is tough about coming up with anything in the moment, I find, is I tend to gravitate, it's sort of a caution too, I tend to gravitate toward other movies
Okay.
as opposed to my own personal experience.
To jog your...
Yeah. And so it's like when I have more ruminative, meditative, whatever it is, time,
Right.
it tends to become more about my own life and less about some movie I saw when I was 7 years old.
Right.
But right now, there's nothing that this is bringing back from my own personal life, thankfully.
Right. Yeah, you don't strike me as a pub goer playing darts.
No, the dart would never have, that's not...
Yeah, Blarney.
Not really
Right.
I didn't even know this was it looks too shiny.
Well,
to
it's
be
a disco
something you
dart.
use. Yeah.
From back in the day.
You got this from Ratner's house? Yes, it is a disco dart.
Right.
But for me, it's a spaceship.
Sounds good. Now, you tend towards, or you've been drawn to fantastic stories, and you mentioned the spaceship, but you do a lot of big movies that deal with the fantastic, but also have the undercurrent of a character or relationship story. Have you always been attracted to those kind of stories?
Those are the movies I grew up loving. I mean, the truth is, when I was in film school, everybody was writing the stories about their childhood, about their dysfunctional family or their mother was an alcoholic.
Everybody thinks their story's worth sharing.
Right, and the truth is that what you're taught in film school and what you're taught by reading these screenwriting books are write what you know.
Right.
And I think people mistake write what you know for write your personal life story.
Right.
You can know things about marriage without it having to be about your parents' marriage.
Right.
And the truth is, I do know a fair amount about marriage from being married and from seeing other marriages, and it expressed itself in an action movie. I grew up loving those films.
When you say those films, you mean the Lucas Spielberg movies from the 80s?
Yes, but even lower on the totem pole than that. I mean, to some extent, I love the Lethal Weapon movies. I love, well, not lower on the totem pole, but I love the Terminator movies.
Right.
I love Die Hard. The first couple movies I think are spectacular, actually.
Right.
First one especially. I really grew up loving genre movies, and certainly the let's say franchise that was the most magical to me was not Star Wars, although I loved Empire Strikes Back more than any of the others. Was the Indiana Jones.
Right.
I mean, I think for a lot of people of our generation, Raiders was a really seminal movie.
Yeah.
And for me, it just felt sophisticated and savvy and mischievous and dangerous in a way that other movies had not. So I gravitate toward those films. Those are the movies I go to see in the movie theater still.
When you sit down to think about your next project, do you think, like you did with the dart, do you think immediately something fantastic or what the larger context is going to be?
No. I mean, I think the first thing I think of is what's the story emotionally? What's the human story at the center of it? And then my mind does leap to these other places. Like I said on Mr. and Mrs. Smith, I wanted to make a movie about marriage therapy, and it leapt to Two Assassins. I mean, I'm working on a movie now, on a script now with Nicole Kidman, and the impetus for the idea was I wanted to make a movie about a woman or a person, it just happened to be a woman, who went from living in their head, a really cerebral existence, which is sort of part of my problem in my personal life, to really becoming visceral and alive and physical for the first time. And instead of that being, I don't even know what the Ice Storm, it was a movie about, the psychiatrist, the CIA, who suddenly gets caught up in a conspiracy. And it was this feeling of, I'm very much a little kid when I write, the same little kid I was when I saw those movies down the block from my house. So, part of what's so exciting to me about seeing films still and certainly writing them and being on the sets of the ones I write, more than anything, is seeing this massive machinery in service of this tiny little emotional story. And
you begin with the emotional story.
I begin with what is the movie about? And then it suddenly metaphorically expresses itself in some other, it explodes into a bigger stage.